The day a cop pointed a gun at my face on my own front porch, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I definitely didn't beg. I just looked at him and thought, you really picked the wrong black woman on the wrong day. Because what he didn't know was that I was an Army colonel assigned to the Pentagon, and the tiny pen in my pocket was recording every word he said. He thought this street was his kingdom, and his badge made him untouchable. He thought people like me should pay to be kept safe, but all it took was one quiet no and one phone call to the right person to flip his whole life inside out. So yeah, this is the story of how Officer Mike Callahan tried to extort me for a community safety fee, ended up pulling a gun and spitting a racial slur, and found out in less than 24 hours what happens when the wrong person finally tells him no. When I moved into Oak Creek Estates, I honestly thought I'd left this kind of thing behind. The houses all matched, the lawns looked ironed. Kids coasted down the street on bikes, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe I could just be another woman unpacking boxes instead of Colonel Imani Hayes. 20-plus years of deployments, briefings, and long nights staring at maps. That morning I was barefoot on the marble white blouse, coffee in hand, trying to decide where the couch should go when the doorbell rang, and in my head it was a neighbor with a welcome basket or maybe someone from the HOA. I opened the door expecting cookies, and instead met a navy uniform filling the doorway, a shiny badge, and a pair of eyes that slid over my body like I was being measured and weighed. He rested his hand on his holster like it was a habit and said, "I'm Officer Callahan. I'm the one who keeps this neighborhood safe," like a line he'd rehearsed 100 times. Then he leaned on the frame like it belonged to him and added, "Things work a certain way around here. And when someone new moves in, especially someone like you, I like to make sure we're on the same page. If you've ever been someone like you in a place people think you don't belong, you know exactly how that lands." My smile stayed polite, but my brain stopped unpacking furniture and started taking notes. He started explaining this little program he ran. Nothing official, of course, just an arrangement where he kept an extra eye on your house, made sure no one messed with your car, that your alarm didn't get overlooked, that the wrong people didn't start hanging around. And in return, you contributed $500 a month cash. No receipts, just between you and the man with the badge. He said it like we were talking about lawn service, casual, easy, but the threat was humming under every word, and it was a tone I recognized from a lot of bad places. Men with guns who treat safety like something they can sell back to you. I asked very calmly, "And if I say no?" And that's when the friendly mask slipped. His eyes went flat. He stepped in closer, so the Glock on his hip was part of the conversation, and said, "Ma'am, I don't think you understand how this works. 500 is nothing for a house like this. You wouldn't want your car keyed or your address to somehow fall off our patrol route or have us show up late when something goes wrong. What are you gonna do? Call the police, sweetheart." I am the police. On the outside, I stayed still. The way command teaches you to hold the line when someone tries to bulldoze you on the inside, every alarm bell I had was ringing, not because of who he was, but because of who I knew would believe him if this ever turned into my word against his. I took a slow breath, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Officer Callahan, I understand you perfectly, and the answer is no. I will not be paying any safety fee, and unless you have official police business with me, I'm going to ask you to leave my property." That word property landed like a slap he was not used to. A black woman in a house like mine framing this space as hers. His jaw clenched, his face flushed, and he leaned in just enough to make it personal. "You're going to regret that," he hissed. "You have no idea who you're messing with." I opened the door a little wider, kept my voice soft, and said, "On the contrary, officer, I think it's you who has no idea who you're talking to." Then I closed the door gently and stood there for a second, forehead against the wood, letting my body admit how shaken it was while my mind moved on to the part where he came back. Because men like that don't take no as an answer, they take it as a challenge. So I went and sat at my desk and treated the whole thing like a mission corrupt local officer, obvious extortion pattern, low odds that anyone above him was actually interested in stopping it, high odds that he'd be back with something nastier now that I'd refused to pay. Maybe 2 hours later, I glanced out the front window and saw the patrol car again. This time with a second officer riding shotgun, younger stiff in his seat, already looking like he regretted his life choices. Before the bell rang, I walked to the little bowl by the door, picked up what looked like a regular silver pen, tapped the clip twice until a tiny light blinked, and slid it into my blouse pocket. Years of intelligence work distilled into one tiny piece of hardware. When I opened the door, Callahan was standing there with his thumbs hooked in his belt, Fake smile cranked all the way up, the younger officer hovering behind him, eyes everywhere but my face. Ma'am Callahan said, all faux courtesy. Now we received an anonymous complaint about a possible code violation at this address, and I could hear the capital letters in his voice. I asked what violation we were talking about, and he launched into this spiel about the municipal code for mailbox height, how the base had to be within a specific range, and how mine appeared to be out of compliance, and as a dedicated public servant, he had a duty to investigate. I looked at him then at the perfectly normal mailbox by the curb, and knew this wasn't about the box at all. It was about proving he could make my life inconvenient anytime he wanted, and wrap it in enough fake procedure to make it look legit. Still, instead of arguing, I smiled and said, "Of course, officer, please measure it. I definitely want to be in full compliance with the code," and that small choice caught him off guard. He pulled out a tape measure anyway, walked over, made a show of stretching it, squinting, muttering, then came back and announced, 46 inches, 1 inch too high, that's a $200 fine, and you've got 48 hours to fix it, like he'd just solved a major crime. I stayed in the doorway, took a half step forward so the pen would catch every word, and said, "For the record, officer, could you confirm that measurement?" "Again?" He frowned. 46 inches, 1 inch too high, he snapped, and I nodded, then turned slightly toward the younger one. "And for the record, Officer Evans, you witnessed that measurement and this citation being issued," and I watched his stomach drop, his eyes flickering between his partner and me. "What is this, you think you're a lawyer?" Callahan scoffed, shoving the ticket at me. "Just take the fine and fix your mailbox." And I took the slip calmly, let my fingers brush his for just a second, and said, "I just like everything documented clearly, officer. It makes it easier if anything is ever reviewed later, you understand." That word documented hit him harder than anything else you could see. Something shifted behind his eyes. The fake politeness slid right off his face, and what was left was pure simmering anger. He stepped in closer again, shrinking the space between us until his uniform filled my vision and his voice dropped low. "You think you're smart, don't you? You think you're better than me." And before I could answer, his hand dropped from the citation pad straight to his holster. I've watched guns come out in the worst places on earth, but there was something about seeing one drawn on a quiet, sunlit sidewalk that made the world tilt. His thumb popped the snap, his fingers wrapped around the grip, and in one smooth, practiced motion, he drew his Glock and brought it up, not quite aimed but absolutely pointed at me on my own front porch. Evans gasped. "Mike, what are you doing? Put the gun down." His voice high and terrified, but Callahan was somewhere else entirely trapped in his own rage and ego. My body was terrified, my heart racing, my palms slick, every instinct screaming to move, but my mind went cold and sharp, taking in every detail, the angle of the barrel, the tremor in his hand, the tightness in his jaw, the exact words coming out of his mouth as he used that weapon like an exclamation point. Now he breathed, "We're going to go back to that safety fee. You're going to pay me $500 a month, and you're going to do it with a smile, or I put a bullet in you." And then he added a racial slur so ugly and familiar that it stripped away whatever thin veil he'd been hiding behind. It wasn't about money or respect anymore. It was about putting a black woman back where he thought she belonged. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I didn't give him that power. I let my eyes flick from the gun back to his face and let him see that I understood exactly what he'd done, not just to me, but to himself, every second of it captured by the tiny blinking pen in my pocket. Somewhere under all that anger, some tiny surviving survival instinct must have kicked in, because eventually you could see the realization creep into his eyes, the breathing change, the awareness that this was not happening in a dark alley with no witnesses. It was happening on a suburban front porch in broad daylight. After a long, heavy pause, he yanked the gun back down and shoved it into his holster with a jerky motion. "Spit out. This isn't over. You have no idea what I can do to you," and stalked off the porch. Evans trailing behind him like a shadow. I closed the door, walked to my office on legs that didn't quite feel like mine, set the citation on the desk, took the pen from my pocket, turned off the recorder, and laid it next to the paper. Two quiet objects in the middle of all that adrenaline, holding his own words like a loaded weapon pointed back at him. Here's where the whole story twists, because I didn't call 911, I didn't go down to the station and try to argue with his buddies. I scrolled through a secure contact list and called General Robert Marks, chairman of the Joint Chiefs and my former commanding officer. He picked up. I gave him a clean, precise report. Times, names, actions. The threat, the slur confirmed that I had the whole thing on audio, and when I finished, there was a long silence. Then he asked, "Are you secure, Colonel?" And when I said yes, he said, "Do not contact local authorities. Do not talk to anyone there. As of this moment, you're under my direct operational command. I'll handle it. Sit tight. The cavalry is coming." And when a man in his position says the cavalry is coming, he means the Department of Justice, the FBI, state investigators, all of it. Not just one annoyed lieutenant with a clipboard. By the time Callahan finished his lunch and drove back to the station, federal agents and state troopers were already in the parking lot. His chief had just been ripped apart on the phone by the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and boxes of files were being carried out the front door. They sat Callahan in a small room, asked him if he'd ever drawn his weapon on me, if he'd ever threatened me, if he'd used any racial language, and he denied all of it. Said it was just about a mailbox, painted me as hysterical. And then they hit play on my recording and let his own voice contradict every lie. Evans told them everything about the safety fees, about the families they'd targeted, mostly minorities and immigrants, and when the feds followed the money, they found those cash payments feeding not just Callahan's pocket, but bank accounts tied to Chief Miller, too. The next morning, the U.S. attorney stood in front of the Oak Creek Police Department with cameras rolling and announced that Officer Mike Callahan and Chief Miller had been arrested on federal charges: deprivation of rights under color of law, extortion assault with a deadly weapon conspiracy, money laundering with potential hate crime charges under review. And then the doors opened and both men were walked out in handcuffs. I watched it on my TV from the same living room that looked out over the porch where a gun had been pointed at me. Watched Callahan try to shout that he'd been set up while the cameras stayed focused on the cuffs around his wrists instead of his excuses. My phone buzzed all day with people from D.C., telling me I'd done the right thing. But the call that meant the most came from an older woman whose voice shook when she said, "Colonel Hayes, we were one of the families he made us pay him every month so our grandson wouldn't get harassed. We never thought anyone could stop him. Thank you. You gave us our voice back." In the weeks that followed, story after story came out: small business owners who'd paid to be left alone, families who'd been threatened into silence, people who thought they were the only ones until the hotline opened and they started hearing echoes of their own fear in other people's voices. The town started to change slowly and messily. Investigations, reforms, new oversight, and for the first time since I moved in, Oak Creek felt like the peaceful neighborhood it had pretended to be. And I wish I could say that justice felt clean and complete, but it didn't, because there's one question that still sits with me, and I want to put it in your lap too. Would this have gone the same way if I wasn't Colonel Imani Hayes with a direct line to the Pentagon? If I'd been a nurse, a teacher, a single mom with the same porch, the same gun in my face, the same slur seared into my memory? Would the cavalry have come running? Or would I have been just another file that quietly disappeared? I used the power I had, and I don't regret it, not for a second. He hurt too many people for too long, but it eats at me that the system sprinted for me while it had been limping past people like Maria and her grandson for years. So if you're still here with me at the end of this story, I want to hear what you think. Was I right to go over everyone's head and bring in the feds? Does the rookie who finally told the truth deserve a second chance? And more importantly, should justice like this depend on who the victim is and what connections they have, or should what happened on that porch be enough all by itself to bring the cavalry for anybody? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me how you see cops' power race and who gets believed, and if you've ever seen or lived through something like this. A quiet act of courage, a moment when someone finally told a bully with a badge, "No, share it," because your story might give somebody else the strength to stand their ground. And if this hit you at all, if it made you angry or hopeful or just a little more awake, hit like, subscribe, and send it to that one person who still thinks it's just a few bad apples, because sometimes it only takes one recorded conversation on a sunny front porch to show everyone how deep the rot really goes.